Thank you for joining us, listening in today. My name is Martin Hamilton. I'm Director of Leeds Civic Trust. This is the second in a series of events, Lockdown, Lowdown, we're calling them, where we talk to various figures connected with the city and really thinking about how we come out of this current emergency in the weeks, months and years to come. I'm delighted today that we're joined by Rachel Reeves MP. Rachel, of course, is MP for Leeds West, has been since 2010, succeeding John Battle. I'm actually a local. I used to live in Leeds West, just over the border now, and was brought up in Bramley. And your predecessor, Rachel, actually got me tickets to the Prime Minister's Question Time in 1988. When I was studying A-level politics, so yeah, that was lovely. Welcome, Rachel. A number of things I want to cover over the next 3/4 of an hour, but I thought it would be useful just to start off maybe by asking you what your current role actually is in the Shadow Cabinet, because it's this slightly odd title of Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which doesn't really tell us anything. But I think we see you quite a bit on the news and on the radio. So maybe you could just start off by saying a bit about what your current role is.
Great, and can I start by thanking you, Martin, and Leeds Civic Trust for inviting me along to town. A big friend, a good friend of Leeds Civic Trust, and all the excellent work that you do. The Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, obviously a very odd and old-fashioned sounding title. It essentially means that I shadow the Cabinet Office team, and the person I shadow is Michael Gove, and so obviously he's got a big role at the centre of government, and my role as his shadow is to scrutinise, to understand what he's doing, and to provide challenge where that's needed as well. The Cabinet Office are responsible for a lot of work around the COVID programme. Michael Gove chairs the Cabinet subcommittee looking at how public services respond to the COVID crisis, and he's now chairing the new Cabinet subcommittee on the government's operational response to COVID. But Michael Gove is also responsible for the Brexit negotiations. There's talks going on this week between the EU and the UK on our future relationship. As you know, Martin, the implementation period, the transition period, ends at the end of this year, and by then we need in place a new trading relationship to avoid the big shocks in terms of tariffs and customs arrangements and all the rest of it. So in normal times that would be taking up almost all of my time, but these aren't normal times, and so most of my time at the moment is spent scrutinising government policy, particularly around the production of personal protective equipment and clothing, the outsourcing of essential government services to the likes of Serco and Deloitte, and to support Keir Starmer, the new leader of the Labour Party, more generally in Labour's response and scrutiny of the COVID crisis.
How's it been generally as an MP over the last 3 months? I mean, it's clearly unusual times for everyone. We've seen the slightly farcical scenes in Westminster a couple of days ago, queuing round the block to vote. But I guess that's a symptom of the slightly unusual times that we live in. Just how has it been practically for you from day to day?
Well, I mean, it's it's strange. It's odd. I represent Leeds West, and in Leeds West there are 26 blocks of high-rise flats. There are a lot of people struggling in incredibly difficult circumstances right now. I don't have those sorts of challenges, but there is a challenge in terms of how I do my work. Usually I would spend half my week out and about in Leeds West. That's just not possible at the moment, and so the meetings that I am having are all on Zoom. Yesterday I met all of the GP surgeries in Leeds West, but like we're meeting now, Martin, that was done on a Zoom call. It was really useful and really productive time spent looking at the challenges that they're facing in referring people to hospitals, their challenges in accessing PPE, what the work they're doing to support our care homes. And so I still think I'm being an active constituency MP, but it's obviously in a very different way to what I'm used to. And we're not doing any of the normal political stuff that you'll remember, Martin, from when you were a councillor, doing the door knocking and the delivering of leaflets. We can't do any of that at the moment. In terms of in Parliament, I've been into Parliament a few times since Keir Starmer appointed me into this new role. When I've spoken at the dispatch box, I've done that from Parliament rather than remotely, and now the option of doing things remotely isn't even available. So I had to go into Parliament on Tuesday this week to vote. We had 3 votes. Each vote took about an hour. I mean, it is really, really bad when we're telling people to social distance and then MPs not leading by example. I think that's really poor. And we did have remote voting set up for a number of weeks, and that was working well. I'm not brilliant at technology, and there have been a few glitches, but it was basically working well, and it was working an awful lot better than seeing MPs, parade through Parliament and then potentially, picking up this this virus and passing it on. So everyone's working differently. I think that Parliament could be a bit more proactive, and we could be a bit better at leading by example in these areas.
You mentioned the constituency work, and maybe just a little bit about sort of what that's telling you about how Leeds as a city is coping. What are your constituents saying? What are GPs, the stakeholders in the city? What are they saying about how Leeds itself is coping with the current crisis?
Well, when the lockdown started, my casework went through the roof. I'd never seen anything like it in the 10 years that I'm an MP. That was particularly from businesses and for workers who were worried about what it would mean for their job and their ability to run their business. Then Labour were pushing at that time for a furlough scheme for business loans and rapid business loans, particularly for smaller businesses, without businesses having to put up any of their own guarantees. As the government brought in those sorts of schemes, that sort of casework declined. We then had lots of issues of people being stuck abroad and not being able to get home because their flights are being cancelled, and looking for support for government in terms of chartering flights and making that available. I think now we've got home pretty much everybody from Leeds West who wanted to get home, but for a period of time we spent a lot of work working with the Foreign Office to ensure that that was happening. I've also done a lot of work with the care homes, contacted all of the care homes in West Leeds about the support that they needed, particularly around PPE, but also testing. And testing still is a real scandal, that we still don't have routine testing in care homes unless somebody has symptoms. The problem is that half the people who are being picked up in the randomized testing don't have symptoms, and so we need to have that consistent testing in care homes across the country. And actually Leeds has been a lot better than many local authorities in supporting care homes, and right at the beginning, when there was no community testing, Leeds City Council was ensuring that care homes could take part in the tests that the NHS had, but that's been a big challenge. Done a lot of work with our local schools. Every single school in Leeds West stayed open right from the beginning. Everyone talks about schools closing. Well, actually, for many children, school was still happening. If you're a child of a key worker, or if your child was vulnerable, then schools stayed open. And schools have done an amazing job in providing education on site for those children, but also the online learning, the phone calls, the organising of free school meals, which has continued. The schools have done a great job, and again, I had a conversation with all of the head teachers in West Leeds. And then we've also got, and again, I think this is a great thing that Leeds City Council on their own initiative set up, community hubs in every ward in the city. And in Leeds West, we've got a really vibrant third sector, charitable sector. And so Barker run the community hub in Bramley, Armley Helping Hands, New Wortley Community Centre and Kirkstall Valley Development Trust run the local hubs in West Leeds. And they've been really, really important in protecting shielded groups, some of the most vulnerable children, also checking up on children who have not been attending school. They've done really fantastic work. So I've been working with many local organisations. All of my office staff are working from home, and so I've got people who are doing the casework, who are organising the community liaison work. We're still working with a lot of businesses, and you know, I remember when we had the floods in Kirkstall in 2015, and I worked really closely with the businesses in Kirkstall and Burley to get them back up and running. And many of those businesses obviously have been affected by this crisis as well. And the recovery from this is obviously going to take a lot longer than the recovery from the floods. And the recovery from the floods was really, really tough. Yeah. And so working with local businesses to ensure they're getting the support they need, but many, and I'm thinking particularly in the hospitality sector and also in the arts sector, it's going to take a long time to get back up and running at anything like full capacity. And so I'll be working with them to make sure they've got ongoing support so that they are still here when they can reopen at capacity.
Yeah. I might come back to the relationship between the local authority, local organisations and national government a bit later on, but I wanted to move on to some specific areas just to ask you for your views on them. And I would say to people listening in, please do contribute via the chat function. I'll try and bring in any points that you raise through the chat function into the conversation. Rachel, I think it's inevitable that there will be a recession. There may well already be a recession, and different places will be affected in different ways, I guess. But Leeds will be hard hit. There's no doubt about it. So I wanted to ask you how you think Leeds as a city, given its profile, should respond to that. How should it come out of the recession? What's the role of national government in helping to achieve that? We've recently seen Germany announce a big stimulus package, but also at a local level, how do you think Leeds needs to approach the process of coming out of recession?
Well, I think that Leeds is well placed to build a different type of economy and society. Leeds for a while now, and Judith Blake, who I know that you had as your first guest as part of this series, has talked about inclusive growth. And it's really, really important, particularly when the economy is struggling, that we put our arms around and protect those who are most vulnerable in society, and also help businesses stay up and running. And one of the reasons why the furlough scheme was so important wasn't just that it meant that people's wages continued to be paid, but that is incredibly important. It was also about keeping businesses and workers connected to each other so that when things can start reopening, as they are doing now, that workers and businesses are still connected. You don't have to start a recruitment process again. It makes it easier to build the economic recovery. But I think it's also really important, and I've spoken a little bit about this before, that while we all want to go back to some sort of normality, I think that this is an opportunity to build a different sort of economy and society as we build back something better than what we've got today. What do I mean by that? I think that there's two key things that I would point to. The first is that this crisis has revealed to us, like nothing before, who our key workers are. And they are people who work in our NHS and our social care. They're people who work in our supermarkets, in our distribution sector, in our food processing and farming sector. They are often underappreciated and undervalued, often underpaid. I think something like half of people who work in social care get paid less than a real living wage, and a quarter of people who work in social care are on 0-hour contracts. And yet without them, society would not be able to function. And so I think the way that we treat people in that foundational part of the economy, what I call the everyday economy, that's got to change after this. But also, we have seen that when there is a crisis, it is possible for government to respond, and to respond quickly. And there is another crisis going on at the moment, and that is the climate crisis and the climate emergency. And in the wake of this crisis, I think we also need to build back an economy that has much stronger foundations in terms of meeting our obligations to future generations to tackle that climate emergency. And so ensuring that we use this opportunity to create those jobs that we know that we need to create in those green parts of the economy. So, for example, we know that the way we heat our homes need to change. Let's fast forward that process and bring it forward so that we start doing the work in those areas now. We know that we need to be generating energy in a different way through things like carbon capture and storage, through tidal energy, through much more solar and wind power. Let's use this opportunity when we know we're going to be needing to create jobs, because so many jobs have been lost, to create those jobs in those sectors that will both create good work, but also meet those challenges that we are looking down the barrel of the gun at.
So these are things in terms of climate emergency that we probably should have been doing anyway. But you think what you're saying is you think this is an opportunity to actually act even quicker and to move those things forward more quickly.
Yes, and I think for a couple of reasons. First of all, we've seen that government, when it needs to, can respond at scale, and we're responding at scale to COVID. We also need to respond at scale to the climate emergency. But also, already we are seeing millions of people claiming for universal credit and job seeker allowance. We could just pay those benefits to people to be out of work, or we could have a massive job creation program to create the jobs that we need, that we know are necessary to build a more sustainable and environmentally friendly economy and society. Let's use this opportunity now to do that, when so many people will otherwise be without work. So that's why I say there's an opportunity here. There's also an opportunity to build back the way we travel in a different way. So already many local authorities, including Leeds, who's been a leader anyway in these areas, particularly around travelling by bike. Let's up the investment in those as well. There's been a huge a surge in the number of people who are cycling, who want to cycle, because it's a safe way to travel, not being cheek by jowl on the buses and the trains, but also obviously it's the most environmentally sustainable way to travel as well. So let's put investment into those things too.
I'll come on to transport next. Just finishing off on this economy issue. Do you think this is primarily a role for government, but whether it's local or national, to kickstart this new economy? Or do you see this as being something led by the private sector with support? How would you frame that?
I think it's all of those things, and actually it's all of our responsibility as citizens as well, to think about the impact that we are having. But certainly, when you're in a situation of a recession, the government really are the spender of last resort, who will need to come in to because of the lack of demand in the economy, both private sector spending and consumer spending. So government have got to lead this from the front, but also government are bailing out a number of sectors of the economy. The economy is only continue to function because government are paying the wages of so many workers. It's a chance for government as well to put some conditions to that. Many airlines are looking for bailouts from government. Those should be conditional on building back those businesses in a different and more sustainable way. That's also true when it comes to things like tax paid and tax status. So if you are registered in an offshore tax haven, and if you're continuing to pay out dividends to shareholders, frankly, you shouldn't be in receipt of taxpayers' money. So it's also an opportunity to say to business, you rely on government, you rely on taxpayers but you've got responsibilities and obligations too. And so your support from taxpayers is conditional on you bringing your tax affairs back to the UK and not paying out dividends to shareholders, but instead reinvesting in the business and keeping employment.
I wanted to, and I wasn't quite sure it was transport. I think it's broader than that. I think it's actually how we use our land. It's a broader question about how we use our land in the light of COVID-19. And I'll say what I mean about that in a second. But you mentioned the airlines. I mean, the airlines, it would seem to me, I mean, I think people, they've said themselves 5 years before they'll get back to normal passenger levels. And that assumes a fair wind in terms of COVID-19. If we have to live with COVID-19, who knows? So the airline industry is going to change radically. The sort of load factors that they used to have to achieve may well not be possible. So do you think things like the Leeds and Bradford Airport expansion, which a planning application is in at the moment to refurbish the terminal, but government policy supports expanding our regional airports, and Leeds and Bradford Airport is one of those. Do you think that's a good thing, given what's happened in the last 3 months?
No, I think that should be put on hold. I think that the demand for air travel is going to be much reduced, not just in the next few months, but for a longer period of time. We're seeing increasingly that people can work from home. You don't need to be physically present in an office to be able to do your job. I expect that business travel will fall quite sharply on the back of this, just because people have seen that there are other ways of working. You don't have to travel to London or to Manchester or to Edinburgh for a meeting. You can do that from the comfort of your home or from your office. And so I don't think this is the right time to be expanding airport capacity when the truth is none of us know what the demand is going to be for air travel in the future. And I do hope it's an opportunity, as I said before, to think about the ways that we travel. And I've long been a big supporter of investment in public transport and reopening railway stations. I was really pleased in Kirkstall that we were able to achieve the first new train station for 30 years in our city when Kirkstall Forge opened in 2016. I think there are other opportunities for new railway stations in our city and in our region. I would like to see more investment in travel by bus. I would also like to see more power given to the combined authority to run bus services rather than it being in the hands of the private operators. But I would also like to see, and I think we will see, more travel by bike and more active travel. But we can better facilitate that. Let's use our canal network, for example, to make to take travel off the roads and perhaps onto the towpaths. There's innovative things that can be done that are being done in some other cities, and Leeds has done lots of good stuff on cycle networks in the last few years. But I think that the demand for that is only going to grow, and that's a good thing. What we don't want to see is for there to be an increase in travel by car. And single person travel by car on the back of this crisis, as people try and stay safe by getting in their cars rather than getting on a bus or a train. So many journeys that we make are short journeys. We shouldn't be using our car.
How would you encourage people to use public transport? Because clearly the message at the moment is don't use it.
Well, I think public transport is hard,
isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to take a while on public transport. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about how we can do that. And government have announced just yesterday, and I've been pushing for this, that we should be wearing face masks when we're in confined spaces. And I think that people making it compulsory to use face masks on public transport, I think will help to boost the confidence of people to do that. But no, it's going to take a long time before we get anything like full capacity on our bus and rail network again. But it's also, I've been pushing, particularly at Bramley Station, but also at Burley Park and Headingley in my constituency, for increased train capacity, longer trains on the lines as well. We needed that before COVID. We absolutely need it now, because we can't go back to the days where people were rammed in like sardines into these train carriages. People aren't going to feel safe, and so things that I've been calling and others have been calling on the train operators to do, that needs to happen now more than ever.
I guess the next few months, it's hard to tell exactly what will happen over the next few months in terms of whatever back to normal means. How many people will end up going back to their offices, back to their workplaces, as against people working from home at least for part of their time. Yes, people may use their cars a bit more rather than using a train or a bus, but there may be fewer people doing that anyway. So the overall balance of that is quite hard to work out at the moment, it seems to me. So it may be, it may be for the next few months that there is this opportunity, this window to actually push forward with cycling, with walking, etc.
Yes, and Leeds City Council are doing that, and I know there's been a big increase in demand for bikes and people getting old bikes repaired. I don't think I had used my bike for about 10 years, but I got it out of the garage and I've got that cleaned up and tidied up, and I've been really enjoying cycling with my kids. And look, frankly, I probably wouldn't have bothered doing that if it hadn't have been for this sort of wake-up call. But I definitely plan to cycle a lot more than I had done previously. That's good for my health, and it's good for the environment as well. And actually, it's good for all our bank balances if we travel more by bike than we do by car. So I think this has definitely been a stimulus to do some things differently and think about the way we live our lives, because I think that everyone's been, reflecting much more on what matters to them in their lives. And you asked at the beginning about what this crisis has meant for the way that we're working. One really nice thing is that I see my children every morning and every evening, which for years I haven't been able to do that. In fact, they're 7 and almost 5. All of their lives I haven't been able to do that. This is the first time in their lives that I've always been there every morning and evening, and that's a really lovely thing. And spending that additional time in my family has been something really precious to me. And when we go back to whatever the new normal is, there are some things that I don't want to go back to. That more time with family is something that I think all of us have enjoyed.
You didn't mention HS2 when you talked about the airport and alternatives. Do you still think HS2 is a project worth pursuing?
I am supportive of HS2, but I recognise that people have got mixed views on it. I don't want an either or approach. Some people say, HS2 or the Northern Powerhouse rail. We need both of those things, and actually HS2 will only be successful if those routes into the hubs, Leeds or Manchester or wherever, if they work effectively. Before I became the MP for Leeds West, I worked in Halifax and lived in Leeds, and the train journey to Halifax took about 40 minutes to do a 17-mile journey on a 2-coach pacer train. The half of the journey you travelled forwards, and then the other half backwards after you got through Bradford interchange. Those arterial routes across West Yorkshire and across the north of England need sorting out, and they need sorting out before HS2 comes in, which was not still going to be for a decade or more in the case of Leeds. So we need to sort those things out, and certainly for the everyday lives of my constituents, it's issues around capacity at Brownlee Station or at Headingley Station, and it's about the bus networks as well. So we need to get those basics right, but I do think that we need greater capacity on those important routes between London and Leeds, but actually between Leeds and Birmingham is really important. And then to get Northern Powerhouse Rail, you need that investment to speed up the trains and get the greater capacity for Northern Powerhouse Rail to be a success.
You mentioned earlier on about your constituency and the number of people living in tower blocks, and one of the vital facilities, if you like, that we've been able to take advantage of, and for people living in tower blocks has been essential, are our parks and open spaces. Without those, it really would have been quite a grim 3 months for a lot of people. And I think looking at sort of how we use our land, office, obviously we have a lot of office space in Leeds City Centre, but if people, at least for part of the time, aren't going to be using that office space, it may be that those uses are not required as much. But actually, what is required for people, particularly who live in flats or don't have private gardens, is more public open space. How do you think we can push forward on that agenda, which is really about quality of life and of course, social distancing, having space to social distance?
I think we're lucky in Leeds that there is a lot of open space, even in inner city areas. So my constituency of Armley, Bramley, Kirkstall, Burley, Farnley, and Wortley, that we do have a lot of parks. I would like to see more investment in our parks, but Armley Park, Bramley Park, Kirkstall Abbey, beautiful green spaces, and no one has to travel very far in Leeds West to get access to a park. And actually, the way we've been using our parks with things like the park run, which we have in Armley and Bramley, of course not at the moment, but usually on a Saturday morning, have brought more people into our parks and using those. We've also got the beautiful River Aire and the Leeds Liverpool Canal running through my constituency, and possibilities certainly on the Kirkstall corridor of doing something much better with the Kirkstall Valley Park, as some people call it. Huge opportunities there. Already work going on with a Kirkstall Valley Farm, for example. And so there are, I think, we are lucky in Leeds. It's an advantage we have over, I think, many cities, is our access to green space. But for the weeks of lockdown, and especially for shielded groups, I've done a lot of work, as you know, Martin, with the high rises in Leeds over the last 10 years. Did a high-rise flat survey not long after I became the MP, and that resulted in some changes around how housing was run and the involvement of tenants in the management of the high-rises. But it's been really tough for older people in flats who were shielded, and for families who were only allowed to go out for half an hour or an hour a day. And I do think we need to think about the lives that people live and the experiences they have. And we do need more investment in green spaces, but we also, frankly, need more investment in housing, because it shouldn't be the case that you've got families with young kids stuck on the 10th floor of a tower block and not getting the space to run around safely. And so I think we need to think about the way that we provide housing. I would like to see more social and proper affordable housing in our city, so that more people have a home, somewhere where they want to live of their own.
An issue that Leeds Civic Trust has been campaigning on recently, and it's sort of come back to the fore really, is that the government changed the rules on planning to allow offices to be converted into residential without full planning permission. It's a permitted development. So the danger is you end up with some very pokey flats that wouldn't be allowed in normal circumstances, with very narrow corridors, with no amenity outside, nowhere to park bicycles, that sort of thing. So we've been speaking to the council about putting this to government, actually, that this is something that needs to change, particularly in the current climate, where we may well see a lot of surplus office accommodation coming on stream, and the pressure to convert into residential. So I think you've got your purpose-built accommodation, you've got your tower blocks which were built to live in, and then you've got office blocks right around the city, actually, not just in the city centre, which have been converted into residential recently. And I'm afraid it's not high quality accommodation. It's not good enough in the current climate, particularly.
Yeah,
and that's something we're going to be pushing on.
I think that's really great, and I've heard a little bit about some of the terrible examples, actually not in Leeds, in Harlow in Essex, of basically families being put in these former office buildings with no local amenities, and that sort of thing is just not acceptable. We've got some really good developments happening in Leeds, like the Kirkstall Forge development, which is a sustainable development because it is built around having this train station that access easily to Leeds and to Bradford stations, as well as the active travel on the towpath. So those sorts of developments are the sorts of things that we want to see more of, with travel built into them and green spaces built into the, maybe built isn't the right word, but green spaces at the heart of those developments, incorporated.
Yeah. we've got about 10 minutes left, and there are a couple more things I want to cover. So I'm going to move on to a slightly different issue, which is something that you've campaigned on through your writing, which is really the role of women in public life, but also the role of forgotten women that perhaps aren't remembered. So you've written about Alice Bacon, the first woman to be an MP in Leeds. You're the second, I think that's correct. But also looking at sculpture in the city that better represents the population. I think many of us will have noticed that the public face of the COVID crisis has been very male, white, and middle-aged. The SAGE groups are predominantly made up of men, and yet this crisis has affected minority groups more than the majority groups, if you want to put it in those terms. So I guess the question is, how do we come out of this crisis in Leeds, particularly in a way that actually embraces the diversity of our city?
That's a brilliant question, and I'm passionate about diversity in all its aspects. And Alice Bacon was MP for Leeds North East and South East between 1945 and 1970, and then there was 40 years where all 8 MPs in Leeds were all white men. And when I was elected in 2010, I became only the second woman to represent our city. Leeds has still never had a non-white MP, and I often go to schools in my constituency and I ask them how many MPs, in the last 100 years do they think in Leeds have been women, and ask them how many they think have been from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And as you can imagine, they never guess none for BAME, and they never guess 2 for women. And then they look around at the group of children sitting at the assembly or whatever, and they think, well, politics doesn't represent us, because here we are in all of our diversity and our community's diversity, and yet that is not reflected. Now we've got Eileen Taylor is Lord Mayor of Leeds, first black woman to be Lord Mayor of Leeds.
She's getting 2 years as well, isn't she, because of
this? Yes. And actually Leeds City Council with Judith Blake as leader, I think she's the only she was the only woman leader of a core city, and actually all the metro mayors, all of the metro mayors are men. And it's brilliant to see Judith as a really formidable and powerful leader of our city, and doing great work, because we are a diverse city, and our leadership of our city, whether that is political leadership, business leadership, cultural leadership, needs to be more reflective of our city. And I say that for 2 reasons. First of all, if you're not diverse, then you're missing out on a huge amount of talent. If you choose from a pool of white middle class middle-aged men, you're going to be missing out on a huge amount of talent. Also, if your decision-making groups are all similar, all think in similar ways, have all had similar backgrounds and similar life experiences, then you're not going to be making the best decisions, because good decision making requires challenge. It requires diversity of thought and opinion, and diversity of experience. And again, you don't get that if everybody making the decisions comes from a very narrow pool of people. And so that's why I think diversity matters. As well as writing my book about Alice a few years ago, I've also been working with Judith, but also with Simone Wonnacott and Kat Makara from Leeds University of the Arts, to commission a sculpture to represent the contribution of women to our city. And that sculpture is going to be on the development between the fantastic Leeds Playhouse and Leeds City College, in that public space there. And Pippa Hale, a Leeds based sculptor, has been chosen to design that, and the sculpture is called Ribbons, and it's going to have on it the names nominated by the public of significant women in our city. And I think it's really important as well that reflects the city in all of its diversity. And we've got some amazing women of colour today and in Leeds' history. women like Nicola Adams, of course, won that Olympic gold medal back at the London Olympics. Corinne Bailey-Rae, female jazz vocalists. Women like Eileen Taylor as well, who I mentioned previously, and Sharon Watson, who runs Phoenix Dance in Leeds. Lots of really talented women of colour, past and present, and it's really important that they are recognised in that sculpture. And I think it also matters because you can't be what you can't see, and it's really difficult for young people growing up to imagine themselves as being an MP or as being the leader of the council or prime minister if the only people you see doing those roles are white men. And so we need to celebrate, I think, the diversity of talent and leadership that we have in our city, to also inspire a future generation of young women, but also young people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, to think that one day they could do take up these leadership roles. And I think that we will have better leaders if they are motivated and inspired to do that and then go on to do it.
Well, I'm pleased to say we had a conversation with Leeds Arts University just before lockdown, actually, and we'll be sponsoring the ribbons piece of art as well. So we're very pleased about that. Final question was just about the relationship again with central and local government, particularly in view of the fact that by this time next year, we're likely to have an elected mayor for West Yorkshire. And so I guess it's often been said that the UK is the most centralised country in Europe. That's been the case for many years. Devolution obviously does offer an opportunity to change that. But do you think, how would you approach the proposal for a mayor in Leeds? What powers? I mean, there are certain powers being proposed, and people can respond to the consultation that's ongoing at the moment. But do you see an elected mayor as another avenue to try and bring local and regional government to the fore in tackling this post-COVID future?
Well, first of all, I think that Leeds has been punching above its weight in the last few years, and I think we've got really strong leadership in our city. I think it's brilliant that Tom Reardon was asked by central government to do work on the contact tracing system to ensure that it was properly integrated into local authorities, and I think that shows the strong leadership that we have in our city, that we were chosen to lead on that piece of work, and Judith's leadership too. But I do believe that having a Metro Mayor for West Yorkshire will ensure that we have greater voice at the decision-making table, and I think over the last few years, as governments have refused our demands in the Leeds City region and West Yorkshire, or the One Yorkshire model that was talked about for a while, that we have missed out on some funding, but also some voice at the table. When the government brings the Metro Mayors together, Leeds is not represented, even though we are one of the biggest and most powerful and most important cities in the country. So I think it is overdue us getting that mayor. But I think the powers that they have, Martin, are really, really important. We want powers over transport and housing. We also want powers over skills. I think that's something that we absolutely want devolved. We've got fantastic universities and colleges and schools, but we know at a local level what skills, what transport, what infrastructure we need in our city and our region. And that's why I think that devolution is really important. Not devolution for devolution's sake, but because decisions are best made when they're closer to the people who are affected by them. And so I think that a mayor for West Yorkshire could get more resources, but also make better decisions and get better value for money at the end of the day for taxpayers as well, because we'll have a better idea of what works for our city and our region. And so I'm excited about that opportunity next May for us, for the first time, to go to the ballot and vote for who we want to be the West Yorkshire, the first West Yorkshire mayor.
You're not tempted to go for it yourself?
I think it's a fantastic job. I'm not going to go for it. I love being the MP for West Leeds. I love the role that I've got now in the shadow cabinet. I'll stick to my job, but it will really matter to my constituents who the mayor of West Yorkshire is. So I'll be working to ensure that we get somebody who's really going to deliver for our region and for my constituents.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, it's noon. It's time to finish, I'm afraid. Just to say, we're going to be doing another session next Wednesday, building back better. We've got Our Future Leeds, we've got the Clean Air Alliance, we've got the Youth Strike Movement, doing a three-way conversation next Wednesday, 11 o'clock. So if anyone's interested in joining that, please go on Eventbrite, look for that particular event, and please reserve a place. But Rachel, this has been a great conversation. We've covered a lot of ground in 3/4 of an hour. There's certainly a lot to think about from what you said, and a lot to be positive about, I think, in terms of the future of Leeds and how we come out of this crisis. So thank you once again, and maybe we'll have another chat in a year's time to see how things have gone.
Thank you, Martin. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.